So the ratio is skewed very heavily. Well, there are lots of companies on both coasts, but the number of really interesting companies in California outstrips the number of interesting companies on the East Coast, probably by somewhere between 10 to 1 and 100 to 1. I mean, it's not even a close competition. I live in New York. I love New York. I'd love to find more great companies in New York. And the rate of growth of interesting opportunities in New York is much higher, but the numbers are so much smaller that it will take a very long time for it to catch up. I mean, I think it's not about the last 5 years so much as it is maybe about the last 15 years. And so I think the way a lot of really interesting companies get started is because one company goes on to be very successful, and there's a whole group of people who kind of grow up inside that startup, and they may be in their late 20s or middle 30s, and they weren't necessarily the top leaders of that company, but they were high enough up in the hierarchy that they had a pretty good purview to understand how that company was successful and what it did. And they also end up being relatively richly rewarded for joining that startup early on. And while they may not have wildly life-changing money all of a sudden, they have enough to have real financial independence and freedom. And those are often the people who go to start the next generation of companies. And so we've seen that, and we know about that on the West Coast. PayPal is the canonical example where LinkedIn came out of PayPal, Yelp came out of PayPal, Jeannie Yammer came out of PayPal. There are many examples of people who did well there and then wanted to do their own companies. On the East Coast, the preeminent example is DoubleClick. DoubleClick was a 1996, 97, 98 sort of vintage company. It went public, and now there's a whole crop of interesting startups in New York, most of which, or many of which, came out of DoubleClick. MongoDB is sort of from DoubleClick alum. Gilt Group was from DoubleClick. Business Insider was from DoubleClick, and there are many others. And so I think what New York is waiting for is what's the next DoubleClick that will give birth to other companies. And probably the most near-term likely candidate for that is Etsy. Etsy's getting to the point where it may have a successful exit one day, and I suspect we'll have a bunch of offspring come from Etsy that might emulate what we've seen time and time again on the West Coast.